Welcome to Office Hours, everybody. I'm Dave Meyer, together with John Arms, who is on the road today. We are excited to have Maryann Lombardi with us. Hey, John.
Hello, happy Friday. Episode number many dozens.
Yes,
all of that.
Trucking.
And I'm driving. I'm on 94 in Minnesota, and I'm not seeing any snow. And
good.
As always, I'm super jazzed to have Maryann. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes,
happy to be here.
And I guess, Maryann, today we're going to talk through about sustainable growth for 2023. And the reason we're excited to have you here live from DC is that you are a force of nature in this space. You know, if you go to MaryannLombardi.com, you'll see that Maryann is a feminist business coach, and she has all kinds of amazing stuff, including a new book that she's put out. It's Your Story to Tell. And we've got all kinds of stuff that we're going to be learning from Maryann today. And without further ado, let's get right to it. So if we're talking about sustainable growth, especially for the fractional community and the marketing and sales community, I think there's a few angles that we look at that through. So Maryann, tell us about what growth is without probably burnout, right? But then also just how do we take advantage of this as either small practitioners in marketing fields or as, people that have hung their shingles out to the world?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dave and John, and I'm so happy to be here. So thank you for the invite. So yeah, absolutely. Well, so one of the things I think we have to think about when we talk about growth before we talk about sustainability is growth is relative, right? I think often when we start talking about what growth is, people have a picture in their mind that may be driven by either what they see on social media, the startup community, or maybe what their peers are doing or something like that. But I think it's very important when we start looking at what growth is to look at what growth is for you, what it is for your business, right? We have to start with what is real and true for us and where our business is, and think about growth from that perspective, as opposed to looking at growth from an outcome perspective based on what everybody else is doing. And that's the first problem. I think that, in my experience, that businesses, small or large or solopreneurs, right? Like people who are working, either in that fractional space or who are running their own businesses with themselves and really tiny teams, is to really look at where am I and where do I want to be within X amount of time, right? Are you looking at growth from a quarter to quarter basis? Are you looking at growth from a year basis? Are you looking at from a strategic growth from a 3 to 5 year basis? But to be very clear, when you start talking about growth, what does it look like to you? And what is the amount of time that we're talking about?
So that's obviously wonderful advice. Let me ask you, Maryann. So there's like this prescribed thing with growth you see a lot. A lot of the investor community and small business, it kind of fits into some normal categories, right? First, I think almost everybody seems to have a number. I know I'm growing if I'm growing by X percent or reach this figure, which, okay, that's fine. Or number of employees, but it sounds like what you're talking about is more not just that, right? It's where do you want to be? What are your aspirations and hopes? Those sort of things, which maybe don't get the credit that they're due.
Yeah, well, and I think it combines both, right? Because I absolutely you need to understand, okay, am I going to be growing by 10%? And quite honestly, what kind of percentage is relative and reasonable for my industry, right? Because a brick and mortar industry, growth for them is a very different industry than a digital entrepreneur or something like that, right? Like growth looks drastically different, but in those two industries. So yes, you absolutely need to know what kind of percentage or what flat numbers you are looking to grow in. But at the same point in time, it's really hard to understand what kind of growth you want if you don't know where the heck you want to go. Right. So these two things are interlaced with each other. And often people just grow the way they see their buddy grow. Right. And they're not really thinking about what is the point of the growth to me. Right. If the point of the growth is to me to build a empire that is a multi-million-dollar empire, it's going to take different things for me to do that than if the growth for me is to maintain a steady lifestyle that I can do and be who I want, not to maintain a more boutique oriented structure to my business, work only about 20 hours a week, right? Like this kind of thing is a very different growth structure and growth plan than it is to grow at this massive, like grow, scale, sell perspective, which is a whole other world.
Are you seeing any trending in that? Are you seeing like, oh yeah, I would call the second part you just said is probably the traditional growth, grow, scale, sell, grow, scale, sell. Maybe non-traditional is live a good life, have a good life balance, don't work so much. Are you seeing any trending on either of those growth paths?
Yes and no. Some of it is pretty stable, right? I don't think we're ever going to get out of the sort of startup mentality of grow 10x scale sell, right? Like there's always going to be this feeling in more traditional startup spaces and cultures that you hustle your butt off in order to accomplish that thing. And that's fine for some people. But I do think that you are seeing a lot more interest in this merging of, well, why have I been sacrificing my life to the altar of my work, right? How do I build, and this is going to get us to the sustainable question, right? Because again, sustainable is another word that means a variety of things, but how do I build a more sustainable environment where I can have a business that grows, that I love, that I can work at, but I also can have a life, and live that life in a way that is meaningful to me, that gives back to my community, that allows me to build a legacy of wealth, allows me to build a legacy of, product, content, whatever it is, that I'm working on, right?
Yeah. Wow.
So I think to your point, I think that is trending, right? And I'm hoping it's not a trend. I'm hoping it's a change, right? Because trends, because trends don't last, change does. So I'm hoping that this is a change that people are really starting to think more deeply about how to structure their work and their life in this kind of way.
I talk about that a lot when we do training at Voyager on, what it means to be a fractional pro and all of that. And, this change, right? We've had this moment called COVID that really made us look at our own mortality,
right?
Which really forces us to really think about, the dimensions of legacy and the dimensions of life's meaning and where I should spend my time. It's changed, right? It's clearly not a fad. This is a sea change we're under. You don't get these that often, where you feel like, tomorrow's going to be it for a lot of people. We're looking at our own mortality in a pandemic, and I think some reprioritization is at hand, and I think that's a good thing. As horrible as the trigger point for that is, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's absolutely a good thing. I think we have a tendency to just run and do without thinking. And that happens for a lot of reasons, right? Like it happens because, it might be the way we have grown up. It might be sort of the images that we have seen about what success looks like. It might be because that's what we were told to do. And I think there's a lot of this comes into our social conditioning, right? And this is different for multiple genders. It is different for multiple experiences, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times you will find you don't actually, and this comes up for women a lot, you don't actually get time to stop and think, well, wait a second, what do I want? And actually women in general stopping to think and ask themselves, what do I want, is actually a radical idea. And I think that in many ways, COVID has allowed a lot of people to take a second to do that and to go, I've been running and I've been doing and I've been trying and but this is not possible. It's not sustainable. And it just feels really bad. Right.
Oh,
so what do I want?
Oh my God. Absolutely. And there's been specifically with women, there's been such pressures, right? To kind of make it radical, right? The lean in, be strong. Don't, there's been so many bad social pressures put on women in literature and in media and just concepts like, good Lord, you got to take a breath. And I think women get an unfair amount of pressure which does not allow them to stop and think and reprioritize.
Yeah.
More than men, I can tell you that. And I'm a man. So there you go.
Yeah.
Well, and especially as you're working in a world that tends to be sort of doom and gloomy right now for women.
Yeah.
And
Right.
for, I know in your work with coaching, you work with women and non-binary entrepreneurs and change makers. And so for those folks who may feel embattered, and rightfully so, and maybe who, dialing into the news every day might not be a happy occurrence. I don't think it is for most folks, but just
right.
What do you do when it feels like the world is, A, in total flux, but B, kind of out to get you, and still grow as a human being, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things, at least that we end up doing a lot with our clients, with my clients specifically, is to ration, right? Because I think if you take in everything, it's really hard to do anything, because like it's just a lot. I mean, not only have we all been through a lot over the past 3 years, but if you just watching the news and hearing the stories and, so it's just a lot. And I think that for many people, and it's sometimes hard when you live in Washington, D.C., right? Because, you feel like you have to be in the know, you have to be watching everything that's happening, but it's amazing how much better you feel when you don't. Now, this doesn't mean that you should be, unaware of the world and unaware of what is happening, but it is important to ration some of this stuff for yourself so you can actually do and take action the way you need to grow in whatever way you're trying to grow. If you're trying to grow your business, then, we have clients where we just say, don't look at the news for a week, right? So that's how we start out. We just don't look at it, and also make a promise to yourself that you do the action of your work before you do that kind of stuff. So that you don't, so it doesn't feed into the things that you were trying to accomplish for your day. So you can set your mind, you can set your intention, you can work your strategy and take the action, right? Because that's what it's about. And take your action. At the end of that action, if you want to take a minute to unwind, if you want to take a minute to check in, if you want to take a minute to look at the stuff that you have decided to put off for a minute, do so. The other thing that we try to do is to get folks to focus on the news that impacts their work. Right?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because you could be looking at the real estate market and you could see all these ups and the downs and whatever. But if your work has nothing to do with the real estate market, maybe you don't need to be an expert at the real estate market, right? Like you just don't need to know everything that is happening in the real estate market. So understanding the trends and the news that are impacting your specific business, your specific environment and world, and then making sure that you look at that after you do what you have to do for the day.
Perfect.
There's a thing that we all grew up with and learned about called the checklist. And, I got to get through my checklist today, and I got to make a checklist and all of that. And I deal with a lot of this. What's on my checklist is a fractional. And I say this all the time, Maryann, everybody's like, put on if you feel like you have to have a checklist, fine. Have 2 hours in every day when the time is accounted for, but you are not. There's not a thing for you to go do. There's not an errand to run. There's not a client to call. And use that time to the best of your emotional and spiritual advantage. The return on that is through the roof. I feel like that's a struggle for some people, and I bet you have some thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, it's a struggle for a lot of people. And just funny. So I'm a brand new empty nester, right? So my kid just went off to college. So it's me and my dog, right? My puppy that's sitting here behind me. Yeah. And one of these things that I have been reacquainted with in my kiddo going off is this thing called boredom. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. It's this really, it gets a bad rap, right? Like boredom gets a really bad rap. But because I have all of this time that I own now, right? And I have released a lot of the mental labor that comes with, caring for your child day in and day out. I still do a bunch of my work. I get all this done. I walk the dog. I do whatever I'm going to do. And then I'm done. And I'm sitting there like, now I could fill that time. I could go see movies. I could go, to events. I could easily fill it in a city like DC. But I've been sitting in this thing called boredom going like, what happens when I just sit there? What happens when I take that walk and I'm not plugged into some like learning, whatever, right? Like I'm just walking. Right. And you're absolutely right that there is such an enormous value from a mental health and emotional health and physical health piece to just touching and sitting a little bit in some of that, whether you call it boredom or whether it's space or whether it's whatever it is. But I think it's necessary to allow your brain to rest and allow your body to rest and rejuvenate.
How big of a contribution is that to growth, do you think?
I think it's
and
key.
Everything that comes with it.
Oh my God, I think it's key, right? Because when two things happen, right? When you are running, your brain in some way starts running so fast that it doesn't know how to stop and make new things happen, right? Because all it does is get into the habit of running and move. And a similar thing happens when you do nothing. Right? You think and you don't act. You just sit there, you atrophy, right? And your brain gets used to atrophying. It just sits there. It doesn't make new ideas and new changes and all that. It just sits there. So the same thing happens at the extremes. And so we really need to pull back from the extremes and sort of figure out how to move a little bit into the middle, to have a little rest, have action, have rest, have action, have rest and action, so that there is this synergy between those two things, because that rest is what brings on those new ideas. It's what brings on the new synapses. It's what brings on that creativity and rejuvenates you so you can act again.
I feel like that has a lot to do with the sustainability part. Yes, you might be able to, if you're going to grow, right? Like, okay, let's have some boredom, so there's room for imagination. So that's a critical ingredient in the what's the jambalaya of growth of what you're going to become. But at the same time, you kind of have to sustain that, and I think that's hard for a lot of people. I did it. I grew. I hit a checkpoint. I hit a milestone. Now I really got to lean in. Boy, isn't that
right.
something?
But this is the hard part about that, is that growth and sustainability require separate and different kinds of things, right? Growth is about is about charging, right? It's about charging forward. It's moving faster. It takes a level of speed and intention. And usually when you're growing, you're moving faster, you're doing more, right? Sustainability is about taking the thing you have and building the systems and the resources for it to be okay as is for a long period of time, right? They require different resources and they require a different thinking and they require just different stuff, right? So if you take the growth energy, the growth mindset and the growth action, and you try to use that to be sustainable, you can't do that, right? So you have
a big
to
thing there.
Right.
It's
so
sprinting versus long distance running, right?
They're absolutely sprinting versus long distance running.
For folks that are focused on, let's say they know they need to sprint, but they also need to focus, and everybody's setting up 2023 already because we're already in the last quarter of the year. So how do you keep the sprint going while maintaining or thinking about sustainability?
Yeah, well, as you know, sprinters, after they sprint, they stop and they stretch and they drink a ton of water, right? And so they don't sprint and then sprint again and then sprint one more time and then sprint and then try to sprint again, right? Like, so I think that this metaphor for sprinting versus long distance running, is a relatively good one, right? Where the long distance runner, they are making sure that they are pacing themselves depending on where they are in that distance, right? And this is where that, like, when you're thinking about your growth and your sustainability, like how far are you thinking? Because that long distance runner is basing their pacing on how far they have to go and what is between point A and point Z. So they're thinking in the long-term perspective of that. And so their pacing is based on that. Some of that pacing, they're going to have to just pick up a little bit during a certain piece of that. And then they're going to ease off at another piece of it. They're going to pick up, they're going to ease off. Right. And that's the process of sustainability, is looking at that long-term growth and going, okay, when am I going to need to speed up? And that speed up is a growth period. And when am I going to need to ease up? Ease up is to sustain this, to look at it, to measure it, to see whether or not it's good. Do I have all the systems in place and the team that I need, and get myself ready, drink that water, stretch for that another push for the next piece of it, right? So they work together, the growth and sustainability, but sustainability is the long-term view and the growth is the short-term look.
Perfect.
Maryann, there are 30 million businesses, according to the SBA, 30 million businesses that qualify as small business. And I think that's under 50 million in revenue or some such number. I can't remember. Every single one needs to have you at their office. This thing, I mean, these topics and this coaching and this advice, I mean, I spend time with investors. I spend time with equity investors and private investors, and I do meetings and seminars, and this stuff is always there.
Yeah. And
it's just, I don't know why it's always there, but it is. And I just feel like, well, there's just not enough Maryann out in the world yet.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm happy to help wherever I can.
It's massively helpful. Well, that was kind of my question: is do you give this? I know you give it to customers. Let's do this. Tell us a little bit about your practice and how that works, because that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. So I've spent the past 20 plus years working with cities and institutions and communities, really building programs and policies and resources that are there to help small business owners, to help entrepreneurs. So I've spent most of my career at the system level, and at that have worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs, either helping them build those businesses or helping them understand how do they use these resources that exist. But over time, I started to get frustrated with the amount of time that system work, how long it took to reach the actual entrepreneur, right, who needed it, right?
Yeah.
Because it changed.
Oh my God,
yeah, it just takes so long for that change to happen. And there's so many pieces in between the work that's getting done and the entrepreneur that needs that work. And so I made a transition in 21 to work 100% with the entrepreneurs and sort of let go of that system work, because I was just getting disillusioned with how much time it takes. And there's a lot of wonderful people who are working at the system level. And I think that's awesome. And I want them to continue and, burn down what they need to and build up what could just work better. My passion is really working directly with the individuals who are running those small businesses, whether or not they're, in a fractional space, whether they are, solo entrepreneurs, whether they're small businesses or micro businesses or that kind of thing. So I work specifically with those individuals to help them build up their businesses, depending on where they are. Some of my work is with individuals who are launching, right? I do a lot of launch work where people are either coming out of corporate, they're ditching that kind of life and trying to build something out of their expertise, their own business. So they're smart and accomplished in what they were doing, but they've never run their own business doing that thing they were doing. So they come to me, I help them build a business. But then I also have people who come in who are usually in businesses that they already have, who are at a growth period, and they're not exactly sure how to make it through that. I have one client who has a startup, a tech startup, and it's growing quite faster than she wanted it to or needed it to. And she now has to jump out from the doing to be the leader of this thing. And there's a transition that it takes to do that, right? Because you have to bring in new staff to do the stuff you weren't doing before. You have to shift your mindset around that. You have to be able to look broadly as opposed to deeply. There's stuff that changes when you become the leader of a company that's growing as opposed to the doer of the company that is growing it, right?
And they were the doers that got them there. Talk about that transition. Obviously, if you read EOS or listen to you or, whatever, there's a logic to it, right? The same people that got you there, they might be the same people on the other side of that checkpoint, but you have to delegate. You have to let go. You have to take on different responsibilities. And I have found that letting go, even for me back when I ran companies, it was so hard and I even knew it. I'm like, I got to do this. And I just didn't know how. Hard, painful lesson. Any tips and ideas, things we can do to get better at it?
Oh, yeah. Well, absolutely. There are some tips, but you're right. It is incredibly difficult. And part of the reason it's difficult is the strengths that you had that make you really good at doing are different strengths than the strengths that people who are leaders have often, right? And so there is a flip of the switch that you have to take in your brain to look at the world differently. And I think we have a tendency not to think about that, right? We don't really get into the weeds of the fact that you are thinking differently when you are the detailed oriented person who is doing everything than you are thinking when you are stepping back to be a leader. So in the case for the work that I've done with people who are in this situation, the first thing that we do is we write down, right, like what it means to be a doer for them, right? Like what is the skills and the actions that they take as a doer, right? We try to outline this in a way that we're kind of auditing everything that they have been doing, right? And we look at that, and we look at all of those skills that are on, like all those actions, all those skills that are on the table, on the paper. And we go, how would you what of this translates to being a leader? And what of this you need to leave in the doing, right? And so we really do this detanglement of their work to say, okay, so before, what you were doing is you had a checklist and you were running through all of these checklists. What would the leader do for the person who has this checklist? How does a leader help that person who was you with the checklist? And we talk through that, right? But we will actually lay it out on a table and show them very strategically and tactically what is the different actions that the doer is taking and the leader is taking. And then we do a ton of mindset work, but we try to break it out into mindset work, into tactical work, right? And then into action, right? So how are those three things changing for you day by day? And then we also try to make sure that they know they don't have to do it all in a minute, right?
Yeah,
well,
that's
a big step.
Is people do think you have to flip a switch, and it takes longer than that, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah,
for sure. Because when the visionary, right, the person who had the checklist and is at the table saying, well, these are what I did, and what the leader has to do is this, and then they start to imagine themselves as the leader. Do they even like that? There's a lot that goes on between the ears in that transition, isn't there?
Yeah, right. And I try to help people recognize that all that stuff that comes up is useful information, but it is not something that you should be judging. Because a lot of times what happens is that all this stuff comes up, and then the individual immediately starts to judge what they're thinking and the opinions and the thoughts that are coming out. Judgment is a business killer, right? So what we try to do is that we try to get them to have these thoughts come up, write them down, put them someplace, and leave it be for a minute, right? Because all of it is interesting information. We want to look at these things, these feelings that are coming up, these thoughts, this stuff that's like rattling around, and you think of it as useful information and be like, wow, I hadn't thought about that. That was interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's interesting to be sitting in this leadership position and going, wow, this sucks, right? Like, that's interesting information, right? It doesn't mean you have to do anything about it. Right? Exactly.
Right.
Don't do anything, but it's nice that you know that, because if you continue to feel that way, then you can start to look at, well, what about it feels yucky, right? What about it do you not like? And then you can disentangle that and like solve that problem. But often when we judge it, we get reactionary, and we say, well, then it must mean I'm not a good leader. It must mean that I don't want to lead. It must mean something, right? We start to judge it. So we do a lot of work about that.
Right.
Oh, no judging. I need a t-shirt that says no judging.
I know.
Judging ruins everything. It just ruins stuff, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. It's a business killer, man.
Oh.
Maryann, it feels like
they never get moved.
Yes. It feels like with a lot of the stuff that we've talked about so far, one of the common themes seems to be mindfulness, and maybe even separating yourself from what's happening. We talked earlier about the media and the space, and maybe going on a unlimited media diet, as we talk through, switching from doer or tactician to manager, focusing and realizing that there's all of these inputs that you need to manage, but you need to set a line in the sand and realize, okay, well, I actually need to help this person instead of doing it all. And so you need to set yourself with a little bit aside from that conversation, right? So you need to take a step back, and you need to get some clarity on who you are and how you're reacting probably as well. So can you give us some tips on how you help those entrepreneurs to get that clarity and to kind of separate themselves from their leadership position versus the tasks that need to get done?
Yeah, well, so much of this work is in three categories, right? Like there's the mindset work that you're talking about. There's the strategy work, which is figuring out what you're going to do. And a lot of clarity comes into both of those things. And then there's like the tactics, there's the action, right? And the action doesn't necessarily need clarity, because the clarity has come to the point that you should already have that clarity by the time you get to the action, right? But the mindset and the strategy require an enormous amount of clarity. And so from a mindset perspective, we really want to make sure that people understand what they want. I know we talked about this before, but we look at, what is it that you want? What's the vision of this thing? What are the circumstances and the expectations, the context that you come into this thing with? Because this is the big thing from a mindset perspective, because we all walk in with circumstances and expectations, right? We're born into an environment that prescripts our identity and who we are and the way we think before we even know what we want and who we are, right? And then you layer on top of that social conditioning, you layer on top of that, like the media, society, peers, everybody who's telling you who you should be and what you want, right? So we're walking around with a load of expectations and circumstances. So vision is important. Context is super important. And then the lack of judgment is the third thing that is incredibly important with this mindset work. So we start with those things. We start with, what is the vision, right? Like, what is the vision of what you want to get done? What is the context that may be keeping you out of getting that vision, right? Might be holding you back from getting that vision. And how do we approach it and build a strategy around it that lacks judgment?
Got it.
Yeah.
So for our folks that are listening in, you might even just start with a piece of paper and put vision, context, and judgment on the paper, and then start listing out, okay, here's what I want. And the context inside of that, this is the bucket that fits into, right?
Yeah, we say, like, so if this is what you want, when you look at your context, what about that context says you can't want that? Or says you can't have that, or says you can't do that? Because your circumstances or your environment, something in the back of you tells you, and maybe not for all things, but some things, if you bump up against a problem mindset wise, something in your context is telling you, you can't do that, you can't have that, you can't want that. Right. So that's what we'll do. We look at the vision of what you want, and then we wrap around what in your context is telling you can't have, can't do, or can't want that thing. And then we'll unpack that. And once we start unpacking it, we'll start to build our strategy. We try to build our strategy while we're unpacking it, because we'll start to unpack it and we'll be like, oh, okay, so I can have that. Okay, if I can't have that, how would I get it? And then we'll start writing down strategy. And then we'll go back to, oh, I can do that. Wow, I can do that. So we start writing the strategy about how do you do that? Right. So it's an integrated process as we go through that. And then the action is actually the easy part. People think the action is the hard part. They get all caught up in tactics and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But the reality is tactics are simple, right? Like they're just action. You just go do them. You test them. If that didn't work, you go back and you do a different tactic, right? Like action is actually the easy part. The mind is the hard part, and then the strategy is the second hardest part, and then action is just easy once you have the other two in tow.
Cool.
Yeah. So true. The I want to talk about, we don't have to right now, but during this program, I do want to hear about your book, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So I'm just telling Dave, let's save some time for that. But one more question maybe before we go there. And that is, and it's maybe just more practical, Maryann, but there's so many, I know that right now the listeners and people are like, this is stuff that small business needs. This is stuff that my client needs. This is stuff that I need. You know, how do people engage with you? Are there remote sessions? Are there seminars? How does that work?
Yeah. So I have a couple ways that folks can work with me. I do a lot of one-on-one work, primarily because I love it. right? And I have some other group programs that are coming out and that kind of thing. But my sweet spot and my love is really that one-on-one work. And I do have other, video things that you can participate in and workshops and all of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to the one-on-one work, usually primarily what I do is I love a lot of these 3-month sprints. So these are talking about that growth areas. I do a lot of 3-month sprints with people where people are coming in order to get their business up and running and launched. Right. Yep. And then I do a ton of these VIP days, which means that I come to you or we're on screen or wherever we're doing it. And we spend an entire day unpacking and getting at the thing that you want to accomplish. And we do it in a day. Right. Because there's a lot of stuff that you can just pack an entire amount of, 3 months of coaching in a day. So that tends to be a lot of what I do. I do have some clients who come in for 6 months or a year, that kind of thing. But I really love the quarters since I'm working with businesses, right? I really love to make sure people, especially when they're starting businesses, that they're thinking about things in quarters. They're thinking about how quick they can change, right? So that they're not so afraid of their action, because this is another thing that comes up is people are afraid to do something wrong. But when you're thinking in 3-month sprints, you can do something, you can test it, you can measure it, and you can go, did that work? Yes. Fabulous. I'm going to do that again, or not so much. Change your tactic, change your strategy, and try something new. So quarters are perfect for that kind of approach.
Love it. 3-month windows. Awesome. Easy, snack size, digestible. Anybody can do it. That makes perfect sense to me. Thank you for I know that was sort of a meat and potatoes kind of question, but I also know people I often don't even know where to start with growth.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of the day-to-day is what it is. And the pressures are what they are. Somebody once told me, when you're a pickle, you can't see what your ingredients are because you're on the inside of the pickle jar.
Yeah.
And there's truth to that. You're only from the outside and only with some perspective, and you really kind of know. I don't know why I had all of a sudden a dill pickle reference, but I did, and we'll just keep going.
No, I love it. It's a great segue. It's a great segue, John, to this next question. It's a good segue to the book.
Perfect.
Tell us about the book.
Yeah. So I have a book that was published in 21. It's called It's Your Story to Tell: Essays on Identity from a Messy Life Well Lived. It in many ways is me putting my mouth where my money is, my money where my mouth is, me doing the work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So when my kid came out as non-binary, one of the things that I had to come to terms with was that I was no longer a mother of a daughter, which was the gender they were assigned at birth. And in that process, it hadn't occurred to me that would have been so hard, right? It didn't occur to me that my identity had been so wrapped up into this idea of being a mother of a daughter. And while I unpacked it, the thing that it made me think of was, what about all the other stories I tell myself? What about all the other labels I give myself? Where the heck do they come from? And why did I choose them? Did I pick them? Or did somebody give that to me? Right? Did somebody just tell me I'm this or that? I know I'm a woman. I feel that way, but why? Right. I call myself my father's daughter. I have a very strong relationship with my dad, very identified, but why, what does that mean to say that? Right. So, and there's a bunch of them. I have 20 some odd, 28 or whatever essays on different topics around this idea of being divorced, being a single parent, feeling guilty for loving being a single parent. I have loved being a single parent. Right. And there's something about that makes me go, wait, I'm not supposed to love being a single parent because that's not what society tells me to do. I'm supposed to want X, Y, and Z. So I wrote a book about unpacking all of these things that I just take for granted of my story. And I think it's important because of all that circumstance expectation stuff for us to really understand what is it about our life we choose and what is it about it that is chosen for us. And yes, this is specific, very specific, I think, to women's lives, but I think it is for everybody, right? Because I think men and individuals of all genders, are in situations where they are expected to behave, to do, to think, and to be certain ways, and I think that's a problem. It can be a problem.
It's a huge problem. Think about that. Just from being, like you said, you're a divorced or a single mom, right? So just you grew up in a world that didn't say this is an aspirational place to be. Now you love it, and it's a wonderful thing, right? But because the world prejudged it and put labels on it, that's incredibly hard to have to deal with that. That must have been so hard to write about.
Yeah, well, what was great about it, in many ways, one, it was therapy. And then the other way,
Yeah,
it just, it helped me unpack a bunch of this stuff. But it also, that self-reflection that we've been talking about, after doing all of that work, knowing what I want and knowing what I want to do and knowing how to do it is the easy stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because you spend that
Tactics.
time to ask yourself some hard questions.
The tactics. The hard questions first, the tactics later.
Yeah, well, and it's a funny book because I can't take things too seriously. So it was also a blast to write because, there's a lot of wacky stories in there and stuff like that. So it's a good read.
And where's it available, Maryann?
It's available on Amazon, or you can go to my
Perfect.
website and get it through there. So.
Okay, perfect.
I have a copy already.
Woo, I love it.
No way, how'd you beat me? That's terrible.
I can't remember. I must have ordered it on Amazon because it's on my desk. So there's that.
Wow,
Perfect.
rock and roll. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't even remember. I do things I don't even remember. But what other cathartic? So a non-binary child, a single mom. What other key subjects do you pick apart in the book?
Getting drunk in Alaska.
Ooh. That happens a lot for people that have been to Alaska, by the way.
Well, I've traveled a lot, and I've traveled a lot with, either boyfriends or my kid or this kind of thing. So I have a lot of stories in there that are wrapped around travel experiences, right? And,
Sure.
and as my kid was figuring out their identity, we went back to back. One year we were in Morocco, and they looked a little bit more like a girl, right? And so having a adult woman and a girl traveling alone was a very fascinating experience, running around, Morocco. And I don't talk too much about this in the book, but I was proposed to, I was hit, there was all sorts of this kind of stuff going on. And people were confused, right? Like they asked me all the time where my husband was and all this kind of stuff. But being in Oman, and granted, they're very different countries. I'm not trying to say that Morocco and Oman are the same country, but then the next year, traveling around Oman with a child who presented much more as a boy was a drastically different experience. And it was fascinating to be the witness of that and to be the experiencer of that, because I was treated very differently because I had my son with me, and we got to do things because I had my son with me that never would have happened if it was or didn't happen when we were in Morocco. And so it's like those kind of things, to be kind of a witness in the world of what it means to sort of walk in different shoes, even though it wasn't my shoes that was walking in, but it was fascinating to experience that. And then there are stories about me getting drunk in Alaska, but.
Well, you got to have those. Is it really a book if it doesn't have a story about getting drunk someplace? Honest to goodness.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to read it if it doesn't have a story about somebody getting drunk somewhere. I mean, come on.
No fun. And otherwise, it wouldn't be any fun. My goodness. Can we talk a little bit about, so we're talking about growth and other things, but women, I think, have added challenges in growing their startups or special practices or individual businesses. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I would love to know why you think women have special challenges growing their business and their startup. I'm curious.
Now I feel like I'm being picked apart, and I like that. So, so the reason I think so, statistically, just as somebody who loves fractional and cares deeply about it, I know that women, independent consultants, do not earn statistically the same amount on the dollar as men. It may be closer than a W-2 job, but it's not equal yet. So there's there's an economic challenge right there. And as a social justice guy, that's wrong, and I want to do everything I can to fix it and help people overcome it. So that's one reason. You want more?
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm always interested in more, but I was curious where you were going with this. There are no doubt gaps, right? Like gaps absolutely exist, and the income gap, wage gap, depending on where you are in the world, is just one of the gaps that are out there, right? Like there's a confidence gap, there's labor gaps, there's authority gaps. There's just the gaps are endless. So from a perspective of the income and the wage gap, and I don't know the back end of the fractional space quite as well as I know the back end of the traditional entrepreneur or small business space. But a lot of times when we set our prices, we have an option to set our prices that are in competitive rates with anybody else, right?
That's what I love about fractional.
Okay, so if you as a fraction, if you can set your prices at the same rates and you take work for people who will actually pay you what you set your rates to be, then like we try to work very hard with our entrepreneurs to make sure that they are not contributing to the wage gap based in their own pricing, right? Because when you get out and you have control over this money stuff, you have to set a rate based on what it is that you need to live, right? Because it's a math equation, right? Your rates are a math equation. How much do I need to make to live the life that I want to live? And what will the market bear, right? Like as an equation between those two things. So you need to set your prices and stick with your prices at a rate that solves that problem without comparing it to other people. Because this is the other problem. Is that we're comparing, right? We spend a lot of time comparing those rates. But in the end, our job as a CEO of our business is to set our rates based on what we need to do to make and to live the life we want to live and how much the market will bear.
Well, and realizing that there's a real perception from the people that you're working with based on that pricing, right? So if you're undervalued versus the other people that they're shopping when they're deciding if they're going to work with you, you're going to have less value. And if you're premier priced, that comes with it. Well, they must be worth it because they're asking for that price.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of psychology attached to that, but I also don't think it's useful in these entrepreneurial spaces necessarily to make a gross generalization about men who may charge more and women who may charge less. Really, if that woman is charging, enough for her to live the life that she wants to live, then damn straight you go. Right. Because, sometimes we get into a situation where we're forcing people to charge more in order to compete in some sort of abstract way. But we try to teach people to think very much in how much do you need to make to live the life you want to live? That's it. Right. Like if you need to take home $500,000 a year, then you need to build your business so that you make or you take home $500,000 a year. So how do you do that? Right. That's where we start.
I love that. We, on the fractional side, we think it can be an equalizer on that. You do set your own rates, which is awesome. And then you start earning those rates and you realize I'm worth it. I'm good enough. I'm better than I thought. And so a lot of confidence comes with that. Now, those rates are really, they're not hard for companies to absorb. They're very low rates relative to a full-time worker, but they're two different things. And so my hope is that all of this Voyager work is we help continue to close some of those gaps, either at the individual level or at the societal level.
Yeah, I hear that.
Because it's important we do that. Dave, I stepped on you for a minute there, and I didn't mean.
No, that's okay. I was going to say that when I'm looking at pricing, a lot of times what I'll do, and especially if I'm working or speaking with someone, and kind of like you, Maryann and John, I work with entrepreneurs that are struggling with coming to market and selling what they do. So I like to try to push people, myself included, my business included, to increase prices until I start feeling imposter syndrome kick in. It's like, whoa, crap. I can't possibly. And then maybe I'll do just a smidge more where I'm feeling a little bit guilty about what I'm charging or what I'm asking for, because that's probably a good indicator of you're pushing yourself to grow and to be worth it.
That's genius, Dave.
Yeah, no, I think that has a I think that has a lot of value to it. I think the one thing I would add there is that I try to make sure that the women I work with, the folks that I work with, never think about or try to divorce themselves from the idea of their rates having anything attached to their worth.
Yes.
Because when
absolutely.
we tell people to raise their prices because they're worth it, or to charge more because you are worth it, what it does is tie this idea that money equals value to you. Like you are more valuable because of that amount of money, which is bad for everybody, right? And traditionally, men have suffered from the fact that their value was attached to how much money they had, which was attached to how much power they had, right? And so many men have to earn more to be powerful, to be valued. Whereas women were, you know, raised and socially conditioned to be your value is whether or not you can care, and whether or not you can raise a family, and whether or not you're pretty, right? Like that's traditionally those values. But when we tell women specifically now to raise your prices because you're worth it, you're telling them to be like a man, to have value in a man's world. And my point is we shouldn't be, nobody, men, women, anybody should not be stuck to the idea that your value is attached to how much money you have, because it's bad for men, women, for everybody, right? So we really try to make it, to divorce it from this idea of value and think about it very strategically based on who your ideal client is, right? If your ideal client is corporations who can pay you a whack lot of money, then, you know, you can charge rates that are pretty high. But if your client is not somebody who could pay those rates, that's where this how much does the market bear thing, you know, you have to base those rates based on what your market is and how much you want to take home, because that's what really matters. You need to know, and this gets back to our very first part of this conversation, is what the heck do you want? What kind of life do you want? How do you want to live? How much money is in the back pocket so you can live that life? Support your family, be generous, do the things you want to do.
Right.
It's actually a pretty simple thing when you look at, like, the market has a lot of complexities, but when you think about, well, what do I need or what do I want? That work that you do with people, I imagine it's a pretty digestible set. This amount of money, pretty, you know, I get it. This much time for myself. It doesn't sound like too complex of a formula.
No, it's not. And it takes the emotion out of it, because again, this is getting the emotion out of that, and getting the, it's not that we don't want you to feel, of course you're going to have emotions, but we want you to take that emotion out of the decision when it comes to this, right? Like take it out of the decision, and by extension, take the judgment out, the opinion out.
Beautiful.
Do people know how to do that? Do people know how to take emotion out? Do they know how to take emotion or judgment out? Is that so ingrained that they have to work hard at that?
In my experience, people have to work hard at it because they do the extremes. They either have a lot of emotion that they put all their emotion in, or they tell people not to feel, right? Because you get a lot of that, right? Which is very different from taking the emotion out of the decision, right? It's very different to take the emotion out than it is to not feel, right? And that's terrible advice to tell somebody that there's no emotion in business and don't feel your emotions. No, feel your emotions, right? Your emotions tell you something. They're important, but just make sure that your decisions are informed by them, but they're not driven by them.
That's big stuff. Oh my goodness. Did you guys, you know, this show I thought was about 20 minutes into it. It's already almost over. This is ridiculous. How good this is. I can't stand
We'll just keep on talking.
Yeah, right.
I can't stand it. It's so good. Sorry, Dave.
We could keep turning over new leaves with Maryann, and, you know, as I'm watching leaves fall to the ground outside. But the thing that I'm taking away from our conversation, I do want to respect your time, Maryann, and thank you so much for this. It's been tremendous, and I can't wait to hear the response from folks that are going to be watching this on the YouTube channel for Voyager U. What, aside from, you know, just setting aside some time for yourself and setting your kind of removing yourself from, you know, value to money, and making sure that you're putting your time and your efforts into being very clear on what you want to accomplish. You know, what do you want our listeners to take away from today, especially as we reframe all the way back to, you know, setting up a fantastic 2023?
Yeah, I would say that whatever you want is possible. And I don't mean that from a, like Instagram,
like not a woo-woo thing.
Life.
Yeah.
I don't mean that. I just mean when you know what you want, it is possible. Right.
Right.
All that it takes is getting your mind right, a strategy, and action. So pick it and do it and measure it later.
Love it.
That is awesome. That is awesome. And there's also a way to start, right? This isn't natural for a lot of people. This I know, startups and early stage businesses, there's an inherent, I'm doing it now and I'm all in, and I don't, even though John tells me I should take 2 hours out of my day and go for walks, I don't always do that. They need help.
Right.
They need help.
Yeah, they do.
They need help. And God bless people for actually reaching out and asking for it and coming onto programs like this and listening and trying to find a different viewpoint on how to grow and sustain. I have found this to be a big relief. I know a lot of people will, I think a lot of people think about growth as a lot of stuff they can't get done. There's empty seats in the org chart and I don't have the money to fill them. So we're going to stop right there. There's not enough money. And so we're going to stop right there. I don't have the energy. We're going to stop right there. There's so many reasons not to grow. I think people are thinking, just don't know where to start.
Yeah. Well, whenever anybody tells me there's no money, that's a big old lie. There's always money.
There's always money, right?
There's
It may not be in the bank, in the pocket. Yep, exactly. But with the priorities straight and what you want set, well, you'll find the resources to get you there. I had a good advisor, Rick Brimacombe. We were chit-chatting about growth the other day, and he's like, no amount of equity capital that comes into a startup is going to solve the biggest issues they need solved. It might help for a while. It might help you develop some product or, pay for some marketing and sales, but it's not the core piece. And he was hoping that message could land at more people. So we're going to do a show about it.
Yeah, no, it's a good thing to do a show about. Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Yes, Maryann, thanks
thank
so
you
much.
so much.
And I wanted to leave everyone. You can find Maryann Lombardi at maryannlombardi.com or on LinkedIn at the same. Just search for Maryann with 2 N's, of course, Lombardi, Lombardi. And that's a wrap on today. This is so much fun, and I'm looking forward to staying in touch, Maryann. This has been wonderful.
That sounds great. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Yep. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.